Hello Year 7s, this is the first of our remote learning lessons about the Tempest. We're actually right at the end of the play now, so it sort of feels a bit strange that we're jumping in to do something different near the finish, but that's just the way things are. In this lesson, you're going to look at how Prospero has developed and now comes across in Act 5. What's interesting about Prospero is he's such an important character throughout, and we'll find out a little bit more about different interpretations of what he's like as a character. To begin with, what I'm asking you to do is answer these tasks in your books, and your starter task is you to write down 2 adjectives to describe Prospero at the beginning of the play. So think right back to the very early scenes. Once you've done that, think about how Prospero changed and how he came across perhaps in the middle of the play, so nearer to where he's introducing Ferdinand to Miranda. Again, what I'm asking you to do is add, if you can, quotations from those scenes that support your ideas. So if you said he was brave, you need a quote to support that. So that is your starter task, is to write those adjectives and the evidence from previous lessons, if you like, in your books. And there's a stretch task as well, where I'm asking you to think about how Shakespeare wanted the audience to feel about Prospero during Act 5. So now we're now at the end act of the play as a whole. And so how do you think, do you speculate, how can you imagine what that audience might have thought about Prospero and what you think Shakespeare wanted them to feel about Prospero? So with these videos, they're here just to help you. The goal is for you to develop and progress yourselves. I'll help you with some questions like I've done now, and we'll use some answers afterwards. So while you do this task, hit the pause button down there, and when you're ready, press the play button, and you can then see how well you did. So answer the question in your book, after you hit the pause button, when you've finished, hit play, and we'll carry on. All right, over to you. Okay, so you should now have come up with a couple of adjectives to describe Prospero, and at the beginning you might see him as being quite angry or quite powerful or magical as he causes the shipwreck. He is quite violent, even though he does promise to Miranda that nobody will be hurt. Imagine the scene that would have been set on the stage of a huge ship perhaps crashing in half and something terrible happening. He obviously banished Caliban, perhaps for good reason. He is very protective of Miranda. So there's lots of things we could have about him as being a father figure. But as he changes, as the play progresses, he changes, doesn't he? So he uses his magic in a more subtle way, so making it difficult for Ferdinand to raise his sword against him. He makes the 2 characters of Miranda and Ferdinand come together and fall in love with the use of Ariel to help them navigate around the island. So he uses much more gentle magic and seems to come across, again, like a father figure, but perhaps a little more loving, a little bit more protective, a little more caring than he did right at the beginning. What we're going to see next is how he changes in this scene. So what I'm going to ask you to do is follow the link on the video there. Here we go. There's a link to a version of the Tempest Act 5 Scene 1 on No Fear Shakespeare, where you can read it all, and you can then see next to it the modern translation as well, so make it a little bit easier. There's only 5 characters at this point because we're only going to read the first 8 pages. Now each page is on a different page on the website, so you just read down to the bottom and then click the arrow and across you go. So it's very straightforward. I want you to take a few minutes now to go to that website, read those 8 pages, and then once you've done that, we're going to do one last task before we wrap up for today. Right, hit the pause button, click the link, go read. Have you done it? It's just there. Okay, oh, you're back. Good. Right, so now you've read that. That gives you an idea of what's been happening. Prospero is making lots of these overblown speeches again. Kind of part of his characteristic is someone who speaks a lot and this doesn't necessarily always say things in a very clear way. certainly not by our standards, but also by Shakespeare's standards. So he's very elaborate in his language. But what we found now is he has finally brought together those people that had crossed him and had banished him and Miranda. So he's now revealed to Alonso that he, in fact, is the Duke of Milan who was banished all those years ago. So that revelation, that little cliffhanger, is a perfect way to stop and to reflect on what we've actually just read. So one of the really key pieces of dialogue from Prospero is when he is speaking, and the extract is here. I'll get it right eventually. The extract is here on your PowerPoint. I want you to read through that one more time. That's probably the most important bit of this half of Act 5. And, excuse me, I want you to answer those questions as well in your books, but it's a really important part of this scene. Now, read that extract, answer those questions as best you can. I'm going to add a little stretch as well, which is on the screen now. Give it a couple of minutes. I think it should take you probably 5 minutes to read the extract and another 10, maybe 15 minutes to answer all those questions in your books. I'll ask you to submit your answers on Google Classroom, just a little comment, to answer those questions. So just copy down what you've written in your books. Go on, keep that evidence that you actually answered the questions and understood it in your books at all times. So you can either take a photograph and upload it, or you can type it back in. It's up to you. But we want to make sure that you're actually doing this independently, and we can trust you to do it without having to pull you in and have a one-to-one meeting. So pause the video and read that extract. There it is. So pause, read, answer questions, and give me 2 minutes, and then we can come back to you. All right, okay, fine. Right, so you've read that very important piece of text that Prospero gave as a speech. Now, you should also have written down answers to those questions. So the first one was, is this a monologue, dialogue, or soliloquy? Well, technically, it's dialogue because it's in a play and a character is speaking. And you use dialogue in literature, in poetry, everything. So anything that's spoken can be classified as dialogue. However, it's specifically a soliloquy because just before he speaks, Ariel's left the stage, and so he is there alone. He is revealing his thoughts to the audience as he describes his actions. So in actual fact, who he's speaking to in question 2 is no other characters, but he's almost speaking out to the supernatural world. So really, on one hand, you've got just the audience. On the other hand, you've got the idea of these spirits and powers that control the world that he perhaps controls, that he is reaching out to. What he says he's done thanks to them, question 3, if you look part way down, it's probably halfway down, he says, you demi-puppets that by moonshine do the green sour ringlets make, whereof the yew not bites, and you whose pastime is to make midnight mushrooms that rejoice to hear the solemn curfew, by whose aid, so who's helped me, weak masters though ye be, so in comparison to Prospero's power, you are, all these spirits and these fairies and demons and so on, are comparatively weak. I have bedimmed the noontide sun. So he has turned down the light during midday, called forth the mutinous winds. Well, we know from right at the beginning, he called forth the winds to tear the ship apart. So he's called forth the mutinous winds. And twixt the green sea, so between the green sea and azured vault. So a vault is like a safe, and azure is a blue. So we can assume he means somewhere between the sea and perhaps the sky, or you could say between the ocean and the seas, because seas tend to be, because they're shallower, more of a lighter green, whereas the sea is deeper, darker blue. 2 parts of the natural world. Set roaring war, so cause kind of chaos. Perhaps this relates back to the Tempest at the beginning, where if we're describing 2 types of sea, he's brought them together to cause this shipwreck. To the dread rattling thunder have I given fire. So he's created lightning, which is pretty cool. And rifted Jove's stout oak with his own bolt. So remember we talked about Jove being, or Jupiter being the Roman god comparison to Zeus. So Zeus's lightning bolt split an oak in half, because again, without dwelling too much on Greek legend, Jupiter and Zeus because they're so important to that family of gods, they had lots of different symbols, and one of the symbols was the oak tree, which is unified across both, as well as the lightning bolt. So the idea that cutting in half a tree with a lightning bolt was kind of ironic, because that's one thing that Zeus really liked and used had power of, which is the lightning. The other was the oak tree, so he would have protected the oak tree. And in fact, if Zeus is anything to go by, he probably would have gone in a disguise as an oak tree at some point. And last bit, the strong-based promontory have I made shake. So a promontory is like a long bit of land that sticks out from an island or a country, and making it shake. So the idea of he's creating earthquakes. So how powerful must Prospero be to make the earth itself shake? So he's saying that all these great things with some help from the kind of supernatural world. So, but he's not being particularly generous. He's saying that it's mainly him. It's like, okay, thanks guys, you helped me out, but this is my deal. Now, what he says he's going to do now, right at the bottom, is really interesting. So at the beginning, with him tracing a circle on the ground in the stage directions, which suggests maybe he's creating some kind of magic circle that he can cast a spell in. And at the end, he says, "But this rough magic, so this powerful magic, I hear abjure. I'm getting rid of it. And when I've required some heavenly music, which even now I do," so you can imagine the music starts to play, perhaps like that which Ariel created earlier on in the play, "to work mine end upon their senses that the airy charm is for," so I'll cast a spell for everybody, "I'll break my staff, bury it certain fathoms in the earth," so very, very deep in the ground, fathoms being, a long, long distance, normally using overland. So in this case, it'd be below land. So anyway, "bury my staff, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book." So the magic books that Gonzalo gave him when he was shipped off to sea in the bark with him and Miranda, he is going to bury them deeper than sound can even echo. So he's going to completely and utterly get rid of his magic staff and his magic books, and that'll be it. He's getting rid of magic. He's abjuring it completely. So we kind of might question it. If you'd got to that point, you might be going, well, why? You're a very magical, powerful person. Why would you not use that to your advantage and keep using it? Why don't you magic yourself back to Naples, or magic Antonio into a frog? I don't know. It's a story, so we have to remember that it's a story. Not all of it's going to make sense. So those are the answers to the task questions. I hope you've got most of those, or at least something close to those. What you should have, if you've gone with a stretch, and even if you haven't, it's really interesting. It's really kind of controversial, perhaps is the wrong word, but interesting nonetheless, is that some critics believe that Prospero as a character was simply a version of Shakespeare. So Shakespeare almost wrote Prospero in his own image. And if that was the case, so let's take that as a given, that Prospero is Shakespeare. Well, what's Prospero doing? He's burying his book and he's burying his staff. Well, what would Shakespeare be comparatively burying? Perhaps a book and a quill or a pen. So he would be saying, I'm retiring. So if Prospero is quitting magic, then, which he called right in the first scene, is art, then perhaps Shakespeare himself is quitting this art of writing plays and poems for good. Now, some people believe that Tempest was his last play, or the last play he wrote on his own, despite it being at the front of the first folio of his plays. So there's a school of thought that says it definitely is his last. Some say it might be his first. There's not much we know for sure about Shakespeare. So we know a few things. But what I find interesting is that in the very initial beginnings of analysing Shakespeare, people thought, yes, this is just a great play, and these are great characters. It's absolutely fine. There's nothing more to look into it. As we progressed with more academic thought, people have thought, actually, perhaps there is a parallel here. Certainly there are things that seem similar in the way that Prospero talks directly to the audience and requires them to applaud him. Is very typical of a playwright. Has to break that fourth wall, which is the imaginary space between what goes on stage and what happens in the audience. There's this idea of in fact, if you know Deadpool, he breaks the fourth wall a lot by talking directly to you as a viewer. So Prospero does that as well, and it's unusual, isn't it? It's a bit strange. So in the 19th century, in 1875, a man called Edward Dowden said, "We identify Prospero in some measure with Shakespeare himself, because the temper of Prospero, so his mood, the grave harmony of his character, his self-mastery, his calm validity of will, and with these, a certain abandonment, a remoteness from the common joys and sorrows of the world are characteristic of Shakespeare as discovered to us all in his later plays. I mean, we don't, as I said, we know, I'm told we know about six things for sure about Shakespeare, and one of them is that he gave his second favourite bed to his wife when he died. So we know very little about Shakespeare, and so making these assumptions are speculative at best, but nonetheless interesting. One of those things where it's a mystery that we can't really solve, we can only guess at, which is why sometimes English is very frustrating. But nonetheless, it is interesting to me. So hopefully you enjoyed that lesson, and we've got some examples of great answers that you've come up with for yourself that you can then upload to Google Classroom. So either type it in or photograph it and post it. Right, that is the end of our lesson. It should have taken you around 35 to 50 minutes, depending on how detailed your answers are. If it took you less time than that, if it took you just the 15 or 20 minutes of this video, then that tells me you're not really doing what you're being asked to do. So at this early stage, when we're still learning how to do things independently, it's really important that you take these lessons as seriously as you would if you're sat in the classroom. I'm going to get your feedback, hopefully, and in the next video I can share with everybody some of the best ideas. But thank you again for watching, and hopefully you'll watch the next video and the next lesson. So see you tomorrow.